Do we have free will? A geneticist argues today, yes, and makes his biological case. Next on the program. Welcome to Mendel's Pod, everyone. I'm Thurl Timpson. The question of free will has troubled philosophers as much as any question going back to the Greeks. The existence of free will has often been argued against by physicists who see themselves as determinists. The laws of physics predict the future, and therefore there is no free will. Determinists argue that there is only one course of events possible. But in our lives, we encounter the realities of making a choice all the time. There would not be a Supreme Court without free will. Or is the Supreme Court just an illusion, as determinists say about free will? Does the murderer always have an alibi? Kevin Mitchell is here. He's an associate professor of genetics and neuroscience at Trinity College in Dublin. And he's the author of a new book called Free Agents: How Evolution Gave Us Free Will. Kevin's research in his lab is aimed at understanding the genetic program specifying the wiring of the brain and its relevance to variation in human faculties, especially to psychiatric and neurological disease, and to perceptual conditions like synesthesia. He writes the Wiring the Brain blog, fantastic blog, and I'm just so pleased to welcome him to Mendel's Pod for the first time. Welcome, Kevin Mitchell.
No, thanks, Thurl. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be on.
So how evolution gave us free will. Wow. We were talking before, what an ambitious task. But thank you for doing it. Thank you for writing this book. It connects so many dots. For me personally, I've been doing this podcast in genetics and biology and reading a little philosophy on the side. But first of all, it indicates that you believe in free will.
Yeah.
So that's, already interesting. And second, that you are a naturalist and physicalist.
Yes.
That would be correct. I think you admitted somewhere you're a reductive materialist.
A non-reductive.
A non-reductive materialist. A non-reductive material. Yeah.
Yeah, and that just means I'm just not going to invoke anything supernatural. Right. That's all that means.
That on the materialist side.
Exactly. The non-reductive thing means something else. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so the ambitious task here is really to naturalize a mental concept, correct?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah. That was the goal, was to take this thorny issue, which as you mentioned in your intro, has been plaguing people for thousands of years, and try and see what modern neuroscience and genetics and other aspects of biology have to say about it, because we're really learning loads about the systems of decision making and action selection and so on. Right? There's a ton of biology that's really relevant to decision making, and a lot of the philosophical literature isn't that well connected with that, with what we're learning from the science. While it was also my view or my impression that some of the science wasn't that well connected with some of the philosophical literature, or was a bit maybe philosophically naive, or at least it took some sort of intuitions, slightly kind of dualist intuitions, and then followed that forward into this thinking that if neuroscience is revealing the mechanisms of decision making, well, then it's your brain making the decision, right? Every time neuroscience shows us something more about the way those things work, it's like leaving less and less space for you to be doing anything. And I think that's an intuition that some people bring. And I wanted to push back against that, because I think that intuition is wrong. It actually invokes this sort of idea of something supernatural that would have to be there, like to satisfy this idea of free will. There'd have to be some free-floating self that isn't somehow physically instantiated, and I think that's a mistake. So what I set out to do in the book was kind of chart a middle course, I hope, where we can say there is a machinery that you use to make decisions, but you really are using it, and the idea of the self, is a real entity with causal power, even though it's not something you can localize physically within your brain in some particular part, right? It's an emergent sort of thing.
Yeah, interesting, very interesting. Because I would agree, that's certainly been my experience, is on the biologist side. They're considering less. It's not that they don't use philosophical assumptions, like you say, they just maybe are not aware of them. And I have to say, it's very refreshing to read a biologist who has some familiarity with philosophy and the debate that's been going on.
Oh, thanks.
But yeah, you mentioned this was one of the ways you push back against Robert Sapolsky, who is out with a book right now, strangely enough, arguing the other path, and
Yes.
using his science and his work to argue that it's determined. And I think you push back in one of your blogs that actually you felt like he was a closet dualist, that he
Yeah.
was using some of these assumptions of dualism.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you can frame the debate in such a way that the only sort of thing that would satisfy your criteria for what free will amounts to would be something supernatural, and then you're just doing a circular argument, right? Because every scientific thing that you discover shows that it's not supernatural. Therefore, there's no you that's this disembodied ghost in the machine that could really be in charge. And yeah, if you frame the debate that way, it's kind of pointless to my mind, because you've got this inflated sort of definition of free will right from the get-go that nothing could ever satisfy, and then that just becomes kind of, frankly, boring. It's just not a useful addition to thinking about it. And you don't have to have these absolutist positions where either you have to, to qualify as free will, your actions have to be completely free from any prior cause, any prior influence whatsoever. Otherwise, it's not free and it's not free will, right? If that's the definition you start with, nothing could meet that.
We'll
And
all
actually,
lose. Yeah.
well, nothing could meet that and continue to be an entity, right? I mean, to be a thing, a self, right? Because to be me involves all of these prior causes of evolution and my genetics and the way I developed and all my experiences that I bring to bear at every moment that I'm making a decision, right? That's what it
Right.
means to be me making a decision. If none of those things are in play, I'm not me. Who's making the decision? There's no me left in
You're
that
not me.
scenario.
There's no reason to make the decision. There's no
Exactly.
impulse.
No
Yeah.
reason, no
So
goal,
So the fact
no
that it
nothing.
happens in a context of influences, as you like to call it, and Sapolsky was saying causes,
Yeah.
but that happens. The fact that it happens in that context is completely natural.
Well, it
That's
has to happen in that
that's why it
context.
would happen.
We
Yeah,
are that context, right?
we are that
Um,
context. Yeah,
and so, but you can go, yeah. So there's this absolutist version of it has to be completely uncaused to be free, and then you can go to the other absolutist extreme and say, well, if there are any influences, then we have no free will, whatsoever. And there's a middle ground where you can say, no, we have these mechanisms that allow us to make decisions, and of course we're constrained by circumstances and by things we've learned before and by our own genetics and by evolution, right? We're constrained to have a human nature generally. We're constrained to have our personal nature. But there's just two different ways of thinking about that. One is that there's a bunch of influences that are informing our decision making. And then given that, we have some degrees of freedom that we operate within. But the other, which is Robert Sapolsky's view, is that all of those influences necessarily add up to 0 degrees of freedom, right?
right.
And that's just, frankly, that's just speculative. There's no evidence that that's the case. It's just an assertion. And it's sort of reinforced by the evidence from each of those areas that shows, look, here's evidence of genetic effect on your behavior, and here's evidence of experiential effects, and here's evidence of evolutionary hormonal effects, and so on. And of course, each of them do have an influence, right?
Yeah.
But the last bit of his little equation, that all of those add up to no room left for freedom, there's no evidence for that claim, and it flies in the face of our everyday experience.
Of our reality, and he acknowledges that, right?
He
I mean, he
does.
doesn't know what to do with that. I mean, we do
Yeah.
have a Supreme Court, as I mentioned earlier.
Well, also, I mean, I heard this quip from somebody else recently when they were when someone mentioned to them a book that someone had written saying there was no free will or there's no self, and he chuckled and he said, "Yeah, well, he still put his name on the book." So it's like, yeah.
Right. Well, I think shortly after I'd been watching that debate between you and Sapolsky a couple months ago, I clicked onto another, the way we do on YouTube, I clicked onto an interview with Noam Chomsky, and he said, I'll talk about this debate when with the determinist who is serious,
Yes.
because I don't want to talk to someone, then they go out and just live their life as though the opposite's the truth.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think, yeah, I don't think anybody can actually live their life really believing in determinism, or really, what comes along with it is a belief that there's no self, that the self is not a thing.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's actually the core of the debate, I think, is actually when we say, do we have free will? It's not the question of what free means or what will means. It's the question of what we mean, right? What does it mean to be a person or an entity or a self? And this is not just for human beings, for any living entity. What does it mean to be a self through time, right? And that's really what distinguishes living things from non-living things, is that the living things do some work to keep themselves organized that way as an entity. And that's where the sort of very basic agency comes from, not just what we recognize and talk about in humans as free will, but how in any organism that's doing something, it is not just being pushed around by causes in the environment. It is a cause of things itself. And it's a cause where we can recognize the important thing is it's not being pushed around by its own parts, right? And that is, in a sense, what I think Robert might say, that's the neural reductive view, which is the "my brain made me do it" bit, or this part of my brain made me do it, right? I ran away because my amygdala was active. Those sorts of things, those reductive, mechanistic, isolating kind of explanations. And you can have a non-reductive way of thinking about those things that's more systems-based, without, again, having to appeal to anything supernatural or woo kind of a disembodied spirit or elan vital or anything like that.
Yes. And so you've mentioned some of the major words in the book, agent, and cause. So let's get into the book. But first, you hinted, I'm just a little bit more curious about you. You hinted that you felt like it was actually an important scientific project.
Yeah.
To basically lay bare some of these assumptions, which are just getting made all the time by, I guess, neuroscientists.
Yeah.
And then you wrote another book called Innate. I didn't have time to read that book. I've got it. I'm going to get to it. Are you basically establishing the self in that book?
Well, not really. I mean, it's funny. So Innate was really about kind of, connecting behavioral genetics and developmental neuroscience with the idea that actually, first of all, we're not born as blank slates. We really do have an individual
we bring
nature.
A lot. Yeah,
absolutely. And it comes from our genetics. It comes from just evolution generally. It also, comes from a largely overlooked source of variation, which is just randomness, some stochasticity in how our brains develop. You can start with the exact same genome and run that developmental program 100 times, and none of those 100 individuals would be exactly the same, right? And we know that from looking at, say, the brains of monozygotic twins and the behavior traits of monozygotic twins. Of course, they're not identical to each other. So
yeah.
So
when did you first think, I'm interested in the self, I'm interested in free will, these things that philosophers talk about, there's rattling around in there, some pejoratively call it the ghost in the machine kind of thing. When did you say, I need to tackle this problem?
Yeah, it started because people used to ask me when I was talking about Innate, and what I was doing there was pushing back, in a sense, against this sort of blank slate idea and saying, no, genetics is important. The way your brains are developed is important. And we do have an individual character that informs and influences our personality and the way that we behave. And when you think about personality traits, what they are is tendencies in our decision making, right? I mean, you might have your decision making weighted. You might weight certain things like rewards more highly than I do. I might rate punishments more highly than you do. That would make me more neurotic than you, right? And that would play out in the way that I behave in my personality traits. Now, a natural response to hearing that is like, wait a minute, what does that mean for free will? Am I really in charge if I'm just, in a sense, playing out my pre-programming? Am I just tuned like a robot and it's a deterministic sort of thing that's just going, there's going to be some stimulus and I'm going to have some internal machinery and I'm going to, just output some behavior and you're going to output a different behavior because you're tuned slightly differently. And so I felt that, I tried to not give that impression, that deterministic impression in innate, but I realized my work wasn't done and that I really needed this, or wanted at least, to do this follow-up. And then it just got me into this whole area of decision making. And I guess the question of like, how is it that you go beyond this idea of these isolated little parts pushing you around? How do you get to a holistic, whole systems kind of view of it, where the self is doing some work without getting into mystical kind of notions, right? How can we have a science of that? And this is where the other thing that I think is really important, that we need to have a non-reductive view of these things. And partly this is informed by my work in psychiatric disorders and so on, where like I'm not a clinician, but I do work in psychiatric genetics and I work with clinicians. And it's very clear that one approach to thinking about things like psychiatric disorders is to say the machine is faulty. And we can figure out using genetics where the faults lie. And then we can figure out some interventions that are drugs or other kinds of interventions in the machine, and that will fix the person's mind, right? And, there's nothing wrong with that except that it's way too narrow, right? In that the person doesn't appear.
It works better with cancer.
Exactly. And in fact, that's where the idea comes from, is because that approach has been so successful for other conditions, right? But for psychiatric things, where you're talking about what it is that makes a person who they are, and how and the interactions of that with all of their experiences and their social relations and everything else, you can't just think of that in this isolated biological reductive way, right? I mean, there is going to be some biology at play, but you need to be able to think about that biology in the context of the person as a whole self. And that, I think, is what we need then is a science of selves and subjects, right? Not just objective molecules and neurons firing and so on, right? We need to know, what does that mean for a person? Because it's their meaningful aspects of their lives that are, in a sense, perturbed in many psychiatric conditions. Of course, there's some biological underpinnings to that, but we need to understand them also at the personal level. And so to me, there was a kind of a motivating factor to consider something like the free will debate, where it sounds like a very esoteric, philosophical, academic debate, right? The kind of thing you just shoot the shit over in the bar late at night, whatever, right? And like,
as we all have, yeah,
exactly. Like nothing important follows from it. But I think something important does follow from it, is having that science of selves and meaning, and trying to naturalize those kinds of ideas.
Right. So that's your goal here, is to naturalize it, to flesh out that science, one bit at a time. So let's talk about a bit of that. I mean, we don't have time to get into the whole book, of course, but I thought I wanted to highlight a couple major points of your argument. The motility argument really grabbed me, right? And you come to this right away when you're talking about single cell organisms. And you look at the history of motility. And I mean, this is just such an informative read, by the way. I mean, it gave me ideas into all kinds of other areas. And really, it was just it was the history of biology.
well, thanks.
which was super cool. But so why is motility important? Why did you focus on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a surprise, right, to many readers that pick up a book on free will and suddenly I'm diving into chemotaxis in bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
The reason is, I think, if we want to understand free will in humans, we need to understand agency. How is it that a living thing can be an agent in the world? That is, it can do things, right? It's not just a place where things are happening.
Right.
You could
Agency
say,
comes from ago, which is to do, I think, right? Agere.
actually, I actually don't know the etymology of the word, but I'm happy to hear that if that's
Oh, okay.
right.
That's what I pull out,
Okay,
off the
yeah.
top of my head.
Well, so we don't talk about agency much in biology, but it's really the defining characteristics. The distinction between living things and non-living things is that the living things are active. They do things. They're causes of things in the world. They're not just acted on by other causes. So I wanted to try and ground some concepts that we were going to need when we get to thinking about humans in the simplest possible behavior that we know of, which is bacteria moving around, basically, in response to things like what sugars or nutrients or threats are in their environment. And so there's what the bacterium is trying to do is stay alive, right? And one way to do that is if conditions change around it, to just reconfigure its own metabolism. So if there's a new sugar, it runs out of one sugar source, it runs out of glucose, but lactose is around, it can turn on its lactose digestion, reconfigure its metabolism, and keep surviving. Or it could, some bacteria will move from aerobic to anaerobic respiration, depending on conditions. Now, that's fine as a strategy, but it only gets you so far, because at some point, the environment may be just so inhospitable that you need to move, especially if you've been dividing and using up all the food, for example. Right?
Yeah.
So being able to move is a really good trick. And then once that's the case, then it becomes really important to ask, well, which way should I move? Right. And then, being able to get information about what's out in the world and to act on that information internally in such a way that you tend to move, say, towards a food source, or you tend to move away from a threat, again, becomes a really good trick, as Dan Dennett would have said, and becomes selected for.
Now, do you think of it as an agent at that point when it can choose to go right or left?
Yeah, so that's the really tricky bit. We're into a very gray area here where our words, I think, run out of precision. I'm happy to think of it as a very basal form of agency. And I'm happy to think of a bacterium as doing a very basal form of cognition, actually, where the challenge facing the bacterium is to survive in a dynamically changing environment. And that's a sort of a problem solving that it has to do, right? It has to figure out, what is the state of the world? What should my state be in order to keep surviving? And sometimes that's reconfiguring its metabolism. Sometimes it's moving one way or the other. But what you get there is a kind of a, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say, no, go ahead.
Okay, what you get there is a kind of a causality that is different from just physical or chemical causality. It's not just things pushing other things around. It's not just a transfer of energy and matter. It's a transfer of information. Right? The bacterium gets some information about what's out in the world, and it has this barrier around it, right? So when it binds something, when a receptor binds something outside it, there's not a transfer of energy. That's not what's causing an effect. There's just a conformational change inside the bacterium, a little wiggle of this transmembrane receptor that basically sends a signal, sends some information. That information is meaningful to the organism if it reflects the presence of something like a food source. It has value for the organism, and that value is anchored on this purpose, which is staying alive. So all of those things together, purpose and meaning and value, are new, right? They're new in the universe when life came along. Before that, there was no purpose, no meaning, no mattering. Nothing mattered to anything because nothing was trying to stay alive. But once you have things
now what exactly? Yeah. So what exactly is mattering there? Where are you getting meaning?
Right. So here
is that because it has a choice between two directions, and
Not
having that choice
necessarily.
gives it a meaning?
Not necessarily. I think you can think of it at this stage as doing things for a reason. And so,
Oh, I
for
see.
example, you could say the
So
bacterium
like goal oriented then.
exactly, exactly.
Okay.
And that goal-oriented sense doesn't necessarily have to involve real-time choice for it to be considered a basal form of agency. In essence, the bacterium is doing things for natural selection's reasons, right? Natural selection has endowed it with a bunch of what engineers call control policies. So it's configured in such a way that when it gets some information, it will do this or that, right? Now, one way to look at that is to say, well, look, that's just a machine. That's just an automaton, okay? You can work out this biochemical pathway that goes from receptor to some signal transduction proteins to the flagellum, which will rotate clockwise or counterclockwise and determine whether it goes this way or tumbles around. And that is a reductive way of looking at what's happening. That is a sort of a natural outcome of the way that we do our experiments, right? If we want to figure out how chemotaxis works, then we control everything else, right? We don't let anything else vary apart from this one thing. Is there a food source here or here? Let me change the gradient a little bit, right? You're modulating one thing at a time.
And it always happens the same way.
Yeah,
You're
and you
saying
hold
they will
exactly.
always, yeah, okay.
Yeah, all of our experiments are set up to control any other variable, any other sort of factors that might change in a natural environment, make sure that they don't. And then we get this view that looks very linear, very reductive, very much like we can isolate this component and say, that's the explanation of this behavior. The bacterium is moving that way because these proteins got phosphorylated inside it, right?
Okay.
And it's not that that's wrong. It's just so incomplete that it gives you a very, I think, wrong view of what actually happens in nature, because these bacteria, of course, are encountering all kinds of stuff, right? There's all sorts of factors changing. There's cell density, there's temperature, there's loads of chemicals out in the world. And what they have to do is actually make a holistic, all things considered judgment. And I use that word advisedly, right? I'm not in a psychological sense, but it's a systems level, integrative kind of process that takes in all of this information. And it includes, by the way, things like what was the situation a second ago or 2 seconds ago, right? Because that's how they compute. Am I going up a gradient or down a gradient? Is they take some temporal slices and so on, right? So there's an integration of load of signals, there's an integration through time, and then there's this sort of holistic judgment that comes to an all things considered sort of view about what's the best thing to do in this scenario, right? It's not this isolated one stimulus, one response. It's what's the scenario that I'm in right now? This is why I refer to it as more of a cognitive problem. What's the scenario? What's the best thing for me to do in this scenario?
And
And that's
is there an instance right there where it could have done a perfectly legitimate other path?
Yeah, well, so here's where you get into this question of how deterministic this kind of scenario is. And in a bacterium, what you'll find is that actually it's doing all of this stuff with noisy components, right? All of these elements that it's using are messy, noisy, little jittery stuff in a wet, warm environment. There's loads of thermal fluctuations, all kinds of noise. Things are colliding, they're binding and unbinding, right? It's all sort of statistical. It's not robotic and algorithmic. It's a wet, messy, dynamical system. And it's not deterministic, at that level. And so there's degrees of freedom there. And actually what the bacterium has to do is exert control. It has to exert sort of this overall control to do what's the good thing to do, right? So you can kind of flip the script rather than say, is it free to do anything? You could say, well, the freedom is the problem, right? That's not what it's, the noisiness, all kinds of things could happen. What it wants to do is control what happens, right? And so that control is the exercise of causal power of the agent as a whole thing, right? Not of its parts. It's a holistic, whole system kind of thing, which you might as well say is the bacterium deciding what to do, with deciding in quotes, because again, I'm not saying it in a psychological term. I don't want to inflate that. to the level of what we think about when humans are doing it, but it's the basic idea of decision making, where we can ground those basic concepts. We can ground, for example, the idea of decisions as like explore or exploit. Should I stay where I am? There's lots of food here, it's good, but maybe the food's going to run out. Maybe I should explore, right? It's a very basic thing that bacteria do. You can see the same dynamic in a lot of our decisions that we
Interesting. Make. Yeah. So we may come up with more of a bacteria kind of term for decision. But it makes sense to me. And I thought this was, you argued this so well that it really laid the foundation for going higher. Right.
Good. I'm glad to hear it, because that was the goal. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, so then the next big move is to multicellular organisms, and how that happened was just so fascinating. The idea of a cell unfolding around another cell, and then they start to have a division of labor, and why does it stick around? And maybe the development of the cell, because it's the cells who stick with other cells that have their same DNA.
Exactly.
And become an organism.
Yeah.
So what do you think is the big move you were making there?
Yeah, well, you start to see a transition from a unicellular organism where unicellular organisms like bacteria are a bit weird when it comes to defining what a single self is, because they're clonal, right? They propagate clonal asexually.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
They're like, when they divide, they're like, it's like making more me. If I divided into two, there'd be more me, right?
It's not really children. It's just more of you.
Yeah, exactly. But when you get to multicellular organisms, the level of the self now changes. And what's important there is that all of the individual cells come together. In fact, in most multicellular organisms, they stay together. That is, they divide and they never disperse, right? So they don't have to aggregate. They just stay stuck together. And then they start to differentiate into different bits. Now, what's important there, as you said, is this division of labor, where it's kind of like in an ant colony, right? Where you've got workers and the army, the fighters and so on. And then there's the queen that's doing the reproduction. Well, in most multicellular organisms, you have the soma, the somatic cells, which have given up their right to reproduce. And they're allowing the germline to do that job. And because it has the same DNA, that's fine, right? What's important is that genome is being reproduced. But you get this division of labor, but then what happens is you get a bigger thing, right? Now it's got different bits. But the problems that it faces are very similar to the bacteria. Like, what's out in the world? What's the situation? And what should I do about it? But now you need to reinvent a bunch of things, right? Now you need to reinvent sensory systems on a whole animal scale. You need to reinvent motor systems on a whole animal scale. And then you need to invent some system for coordinating between them. And that's really what the nervous system is. And so
and you also
evolution of the nervous system, sorry, as a control system. I guess that's one of the key
control system,
key ways of looking at it, is that that's what the nervous system is for. It's for controlling behavior and maintaining homeostasis or allostasis, that keeping yourself alive under varying conditions. That's its first job, evolutionarily speaking. And the idea of cognition and ultimately metacognition and consciousness, they all kind of scaffold on top of that, and they're valuable in the service of controlling things to stay alive.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah. So you're working your way up. But even when it first becomes multicellular, yes, it's bigger. It's got this division of labor. One of the division of labor is this bacteria cell, which it incorporated, which generates ATP, which is now giving it so much more energy than the single cell.
So this is this symbiosis theory of mitochondria, right? So mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. And there's a very well-established theory now that came from Lynn Margulis and others in the 70s, that actually what happened was that some archaeal cell engulfed a bacteria that became mitochondria. And what's interesting here for this story is that gave a kind of, it was like sort of domesticating some animals, right? It's like inventing agriculture. It gave such a surplus of energy that it allowed a kind of a flourishing, right? It allowed, in a sense, eukaryotic cells to carry more genes in one, at a certain level. Genes are expensive, metabolic, right? And bacteria keep their genomes really streamlined, and they get rid of genes that they're not using. Right? So, but eukaryotes, their genomes could expand because they had this kind of energy surplus. At least that's one theory. And
those genomes can hold cool genes that make awesome new proteins.
Well, exactly. And what they can also do is effectively multiplex more cellular states, right? The more genes you have, the more kind of information coding capacity of the genome to define a muscle cell or a nerve cell or a skin cell, because each of those cells is defined by a combination of gene expression patterns. And the more genes you have, the more diverse cell types you can create. And that's where this amazing, expansion and diversification of eukaryotic body shapes and cell types emerged from.
You mentioned information. Well, we're talking genetics. Information. It's a very rich space for biology, right? And we're probably just beginning, right? Developing different information theories. And you do bring up Shannon information. Shannon was this guy who developed a theory at Bell Labs. But my understanding was it was I mean, we learned at that point to transmit signals across long distances.
Yes.
And this was part of that. So what part of information theory does the complex organism, the growing complexity need? And do you tie the information theory into the free will?
Well, yeah, I mean, so Shannon's information theory was really about signal transmission. And it was about doing that faithfully with through a noisy medium. And it laid the basis for information technology and so on. But what's interesting about it is it's completely agnostic as to what the message means. In fact, a random string of digits or something like that has more information in it, in Shannon's terms, than a meaningful one. And the reason is that you have to send the whole thing in order to reconstruct it. If it's
right, a meaningful one, you can do some prediction, and that gives you some shortcuts.
And you can do some compression and so on, right? So what's interesting, what I was trying to do in the book was take that Shannon's idea of information theory as a launching pad and say, well, okay, that's fine, but that's not what organisms need, right? In the nervous system, we're not just sending a message. We're not encoding something and sending it such that it can be decoded at the other end, right? What's the point? There's no point to that, right? What we're doing, what neurons are doing, is extracting meaning from the incoming signals, by doing some sort of computations and based over the weights of their connections and so on. And then they're sending that transformed information further along the line or broadcasting it to other parts of the brain. So what I wanted to do was move from this sort of simple idea of information theory to the more complicated science of semantics or semiotics, that is, of meaningful patterns in the brain, which is really the important bit, because actually it's patterns that mean something, which is that's the currency that our brain operates with, right? You can think about, again, in a causal sense, if I'm looking at your face right now, right? So there's some neurons in my ventral visual stream that are extracting different aspects of the environment. So as we go through this hierarchy, they're extracting different meaningful bits of information about the visual scene, and they're segmenting features and objects and background and so on. And ultimately, you come to an area that is really responsive to faces. So right now, this part of my brain is active because it's looking at your face, and that's telling other parts of my brain, hey, there's a face out there in the world. It's Terrell's face. So that's useful internal represented information now in the brain, but it's meaningful information. So there's sort of two aspects that are really important there. One is we've broken the whole stimulus response thing, right? Now we have all of this internal stuff that's happening. Now we have me representing
There's a lot of intermediary, is that what you mean?
Exactly. But I'm also bringing everything about my past to that, because I'm connecting what I know about faces, what I know about you, what I know about talking to people on Zoom, right? What I know about circumstances like the ones we're in right now, in the service of making a decision. And so ultimately it cashes out in some behavior, but not in any deterministic kind of a way, right? It's this all things considered system that we have in order to do that. So yeah, the goal was to go from information, where there's a very grounded quantitative science that you and a technology around it, to meaning, which is slipperier. You can't quantify meaning, you can't localize the meaning. It's very much a relational, interpretive, subjective kind of thing, but it's exactly what organisms need to get around in the world. They need to know what's meaningful, what's the meaning of what they need to make sense of their sensory data, to say what's out in the world, to solve this cognitive problem that they always are encountering.
Okay, yeah, because sometimes in this debate we talk about bottom up argument or top down, right?
Yeah.
And Sapolsky is and determinists such as Sean Carroll, physicist,
Yes.
they're bottom up people. You know, it's all bits and atoms, and that causes everything. And what you're talking about now is some top down when you get meaning.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the important thing is that
although your whole argument, which is that evolution gave us free will, that hints at a bottom up. So maybe have you done both?
Well, it hints at, yeah, I mean, it hints at an emergent process, right? I mean, evolution is an emergent process. That is, things emerge through time. In a gradual way, and each step along the pathway generates some new possibilities that didn't exist before that can then be explored. And that's a generative kind of a process, right? So, but what's interesting, if you think about, this idea of top-down causation, again, this is something that philosophically a lot of people have trouble with, because it seems to violate this notion of determinism, right? So one view of determinism is that physics is just completely deterministic. The atoms are just going to do whatever they do according to the laws of physics. And everything else is kind of an epiphenomenon. All the real causation is down here at the bottom level of atoms and molecules, or even quantum fields or strings, or whatever we take to be the lowest, most fundamental level of reality. Now, that breaks down really quickly, because actually the physics itself is not deterministic. Right? If you know the complete state of a system right now, and you subject it to the laws of physics, all kinds of random stuff can happen. And in fact, it's impossible to know the complete state of a system with infinite precision at any moment, for all kinds of physics reasons. Right? So the idea that physics says the universe is deterministic is just wrong. Physics says nothing of the sort. And it's a weird place to start the debate about free will, but everyone's sort of accepting this premise and then trying to figure out what it means for free will. Instead, you can have this view of a kind of a indeterminacy, which is not a free-for-all. It's not that anything could happen, right? There are certain probabilities for things that could happen. But what actually does happen is not pre-stated, right? And so when you have that kind of a scenario, then there's an opportunity for something else to settle the matter, right? If multiple things could happen, then something else besides the low-level laws of physics, which aren't sufficient to determine what happens next, something else could have an effect. And that something else is just the way that the system is organized, right? It's what physicists would call the initial conditions, or the boundary conditions of the system that you're looking at. What you could also call the constraints, or the constraint regime that the system is in. It's not magic. It's just that the physical forces of what's happening in there are constrained by the way that the system is set up. And sometimes those constraints are there for a functional reason. So in the machines that we're using to talk to each other, the flow of electrons is constrained by the way the hardware is configured and the software program that's running on, right? Really an abstract idea, the software, and it's implemented in the physical stuff in a way that doesn't violate the laws of physics, right? The electrons are still
I mean, could you say we use the laws of physics?
Yeah, exactly. We're just constraining stuff, right? And so living organisms do the exact same thing. They are organized, right? That's why we call them organisms. they're organized in such a way as to stay alive. And in order to do that, they have lots of functional bits that are organized to do little jobs. And some of those little jobs involve controlling things like what to do, or where to move, or what action to take, what decision to make. So those functionalities can emerge without violating physics. And when they emerge, then they can have some top-down effects on what the lower level bits are doing, in exactly the same way that the software that's running on your computer is affecting the way the electrons are moving around.
Okay, so let's pull back now. We got to start wrapping up, and just and just have some general thoughts here. I mean, I thought you made a great case. What are some of the implications of the argument that you've made here? I'm thinking for biology, for other disciplines.
Yeah.
So the philosophical free will debate.
Yeah, I mean, for philosophy, I think that I hope that this offers a different, new way of thinking about free will, which is not it doesn't really fall in any of the categories that already exist of either free will skepticism or compatibilism, both of which accept determinism to begin with, which is weird, or libertarianism, which I'm closest to, but it involves a strange kind of view of randomness that I don't subscribe to. And I think the view that I propose here is a more reasonable one, and one that allows something like free will to emerge. On the biological side, I think, like I said, this is aligned with ideas in neuroscience that are trying to connect neural goings on with mental goings on. Right? I mean, that's really, you could say, the mission of neuroscience. How is the neural activity in here causing or
a mental state? By the way, you're good with a mental state, right? You're good with the terms mental.
Absolutely. And
isn't that a kind of dualism then? I'm not saying they're different substances.
Well, exactly. Okay, so what is it? The question is, what do you mean by a mental state? And when I use the word, when I say something like a thought, then what I want to say is that a thought is a pattern of neural activity that means something. And the content of the thought is what it means to the organism. But the pattern of neural activity is a real physical thing. It's a real physical instantiation. And that pattern can have causal effects in the brain. So if we're thinking about mental causation, how could my having a thought push ions around in other nerves, right? That's exactly the same problem as saying, how can the abstract content of a software program push electrons around, right? It's just accomplished by constraints and by criteria that determine when one neuron gets some inputs, it does this, and that it extracts some meaning from its inputs and so on. So I think the move to a science of meaning is what's going to allow us to connect the neural goings on to the mental goings on, to connect neuroscience and cognitive science and psychology, as opposed to what we're sort of maybe in danger of doing, which is eliminating the cognitive and psychological and saying, that's all just epiphenomena. All the real work is done in the neural machinery, right? And I just think that's just wrong.
Yeah, I do too. I do too.
Yeah, but
my example for that is like, it's like trying to reflect, let's say, a Beethoven symphony, by showing you a map of the subway that gets you to Symphony Hall.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much extra higher level information that is extracted by the system that's just not there in the lower level bits. Basically, you have to do extra work to get it out, and the system is causally sensitive to the meanings of those patterns as opposed to the momentary neural instantiations, right? A lot of the momentary details of neural firings are washed out in the system, or they're noisy, right? What matters is, what is the pattern, right? That's the pattern that's your face, for example, at the moment, as opposed to somebody else's face. And you could turn your head and I'd still be responding to that information as meaning you, regardless of all those other things. So yeah, on the biological front, I like to think that there's a move towards this more systems-based neuroscience that incorporates the meaningfulness of these different
Meaningfulness. Oh, okay.
patterns.
Yeah,
Yeah.
cool.
And then
Yeah.
finally, just the other area where I think this is really interesting is in artificial intelligence and artificial life. And the systems that we have to date, while they're incredibly impressive, they're very limited in that they're not agents. Right? They're not interacting in the world. They're not trying to stay alive. They don't have any stake. They don't have any skin in the game, and they're not.
They don't have any meaning.
They have nothing matters to them. Right? Things aren't meaningful. They have information, but they're not meaningful, and so they're limited in their ability to generalize to other things because they haven't really been forced to do that in many cases, right? So I think it's interesting if one has the goal of making an artificial general intelligence, getting to AGI, and it's debatable whether we should, but if that's your goal, then I think we may have to think about making an intelligence, making an entity that has some agency, that's a self, which opens up whole cans of ethical worms, right? But also, means that we could that the AI field might look to not just human neuroscience, but more, neuroscience of more basic kinds of creatures, and say, okay, you know what? If I could build something that's like the nervous system of a nematode or a hydra or something like that, we'd be doing well. We'd be doing much better than we are now. We'd be much closer to AGI than we are now, or than we'll get to if we just scale up large language model. Right? We're just not going to get there.
Now, do you mean build a wet nematode or
you could
an
you could do
AI
it.
nematode, an AI with the decision-making apparatus of a nematode?
Yeah, exactly. But that kind of neural architecture, but also with the same kinds of relations with its environment, and with the same kinds of perpetuating itself through time, predicting its continued existence, and persisting.
Yeah. So just quickly, do you have any problem going from wet to dry?
Well, no, I think you could do that in silico, right? It doesn't have to be a robot interacting with things in the real physical world. It could be a virtual robotic type of thing interacting in a virtual environment. I think you could set up simulations like that where, for me, the reason to do this, it would be as a tool, right, as a workspace to try and figure out if we can simulate these nervous systems as simulated agents in a simulated environment, then we can tweak them, and we can start to figure out how the emergent properties and behaviors and so on rely on the individual components. Because, while I'm advancing a kind of a holistic systems level view, I'm not denying, of course, that systems level behavior relies on the individual bits, but we don't really know how, right? It's not in any linear kind of a way. It's in a highly nonlinear distributed kind of a way. And having a sandbox, as the computer scientists call it, to play around in, where you've got these virtual agents with cognitive systems that have an architecture that we can try to make sense of, would help us understand the biology. That would be my own motivating factor, not to create the agents for the sake of them being useful for something else.
Right, but for understanding biology. Yeah, exactly. So you've mentioned your systems approach, which I just find really refreshing. Let's just wrap up and talk about, this is, by the way, this is the reason that we're including this interview in our series called The New Biology. And basically we're trying to talk to people who are non-reductivists, okay, and who are looking at different options, because we've been so genocentric now since Watson and Crick, and so to open up and look at, consider new directions. And that was really one of the major things I got from your book, besides the whole free will argument, was just that you are looking at biology different. So you said you believe in emergence. On the materialist side, you don't believe in anything metaphysical, like numbers or mathematics?
Oh, you know what? I don't even know what that means, to believe in it. or not? Do I believe in numbers? Do I believe in like they exist in some sense? I guess that I do. I mean, one thing I will say about emergence, which is a tricky, super slippery term, because it usually it breaks down into one of two varieties. One is weak emergence, where the behavior of the whole thing just directly really emerges from low-level interactions, like the murmurations of starlings, for example. So the behavior of the whole flock can be modeled and simulated just based on some simple rules of local interactions. That's just boring, right? There's nothing interesting about the murmurations of starlings. They're pretty, but that's all. And then you get the kind of the claims of strong emergence, like with consciousness, where suddenly it's supposed to pop into existence, and it's like you're getting a free lunch, right? And that just seems weird and almost like invoking a miracle or some sort of magic. I'm not a fan of either of those uses, frankly. And I try to not use the word at all. But what is interesting, though,
you mean the word emergence or the word conscious?
Yeah. Oh, emergent, okay. Yeah. If we think about what's fundamental, that is what just exists and doesn't require anything else to explain it, then you can go to the laws of physics and say, we're just going to take these laws of physics as fundamental, and we can derive other things from them, right? We can derive lots of behavior once we know Schrodinger equation and the whatever cosmological constant and all these different things, right? So many people take that the laws of physics are the most fundamental thing and the only fundamental thing, and they're really, really low level, right? Now, I would say actually that that's a mistake. I think there are fundamental systems principles that just hold. I don't want to say they exist, but they hold true in an abstract kind of a way. So, for example,
is that more like mathematics?
Yeah, well, it would be like sort of design principles. So, for example, if you put certain elements of a network together with the right kinds of interactions, excitatory and inhibitory, or activating and repressing, then you'll get an oscillator. And you can do this with electrical circuits. You can see it in genetic networks. You can see it in neural networks and so on, right? So,
and that step seems to be emergent.
Yeah, well, what I want to say is that the design principle of an oscillator is fundamental. That just holds true.
That will always hold true. Yeah.
Nothing else is required. It's not derived from anything else, right? It just holds true. And you could say the same thing about all kinds of mathematical operations, like a filter or an amplifier or all sorts of other things like that. The kinds of things that form the basis of genetic networks and developmental biology and neural networks and cognition and so on.
And we wouldn't particularly categorize that in physics?
Well, there is a whole physics of systems principles, and there's whole areas of like cybernetics and dynamical systems theory and network theory that deal with these things. And what I want to say is that those mathematical operations and ideas are just as fundamental as any of the laws of physics. What's interesting there is that what that means is that evolution doesn't have to invent oscillators and amplifiers. It just has to find its way into that functional space, right? So it's not a free lunch. These things are not just popping into existence out of nowhere. They're being discovered. And that casts evolution in a different light, right? It means that it's not just having to invent all this magical stuff, which is hard for people to accept. It seems like you're getting too much for nothing. You're not getting too much for nothing. It already exists in that abstract sense, and evolution can find it. And when it finds it, then it can say, well, that's great. I can use that amplifier in this circuit. I can use that oscillator. I can use these various coincidence detector or an evidence accumulator or a Bayesian predictor, all of those different things. And so that's a different kind of view where the functionalities that emerge through evolution, it's not this strong emergence where they just suddenly pop into existence. It's more this kind of discovery aspect.
They found that abstract system.
Yeah.
Or filled into it somehow.
Yeah, and then it worked, and they kept it, and then they built on it, right? Because evolution has that ratchet.
Cool, I like that.
That ratchet behavior of evolution is another one of these abstract principles. It's the algorithm of natural selection just holds, right? If you have a population of things and you let them vary and you submit them to selection and you have a new population and keep doing that over and over again, you'll get some evolutionary change. that just holds in the abstract. That's why we can do genetic algorithms for computer programs, for example, because that's just a principle that's true. And it doesn't derive from the laws of physics or anything else. It just fundamentally holds. So,
okay, final question. I think I agree with you there. That's fascinating. It's a great place to kind of leave it. But where do you think biology's headed these days? I mean, if you were to go to university today, what would you study? What do you really find interesting?
What I find really, really interesting these days is the fact that systems biology is now coming to the fore, and for reasons that are, on one hand, technological. So, for example, in neuroscience, we can now record thousands and thousands of neurons, their activity all at the same time in an awake, behaving animal while it's doing different things, right? Whereas before, all we could do was poke a few neurons in a slice or in an anesthetized animal, right? Now we can see the activity of the whole brain, and now we're developing a kind of a mathematics and a computational framework that allows us to extract the meaningful patterns within all that huge mass of data. And we have the computational power to do it. And what's really interesting is to think, while we're doing that, we may be uncovering principles or using the exact same principles that the brain is using to make sense of all that meaning, all that data.
I see. Right? So we need to go principle hunting.
I think so, yeah.
Which relates to the last thing you said.
Yeah, exactly. So these systems principles to me are so powerful. And you can see the exact same thing. We're thinking about developmental biology, right? How is the form of an organism encoded in the genome? You need to have the exact same kind of systems principles because it's encoded in a distributed way, in a non-linear, collective kind of a way, not with one gene makes one bit of the organism and another gene makes another bit of the organism, right? It's not like that. So we need a systems way of thinking about it. And we have these computational tools. We have amazing, experimental tools to get all of this data. I mentioned in neuroscience, recording loads of neurons. In developmental biology, it's recording, gene expression levels of every single cell in a developing embryo. And what's really, really interesting and just so sort of intellectually stimulating to me right now is that the same principles are emerging. Right? It turns out there's some principles of dynamical systems, there's some principles of information compression and redundancy and decoding and all that kind of stuff that are at play in these different systems. So if I was going back to school right now, I would be wanting to learn some of these computational techniques and tools and principles and subsystems principles. And in fact, over the last couple of years, I've started teaching a module in Trinity College, Dublin, where I am, which is exactly on this systems thinking. We call it rather grandly, the systems, the science of everything. Because the point is you can identify some principles that hold in genetic networks or social networks, in ecologies or in economies, in biological materials or in business. And so with colleagues from other parts of the university, we're teaching this course. And that's something that I never in my own education got any exposure to. And I always kind of felt this frustration when I'd be looking at a developmental system and thinking, okay, I can see the details of what's happening, but why? Like, what is it doing? Why is this circuit, phosphorylation circuit, like that? Why is this, and there are principles, there are engineering principles, there are mathematics principles, physics principles that can be brought to bear that aren't reductive. That's the exciting thing for me, right? We're not going to for reductive kind of.
They're not reductive because of what? I mean, ultimately, when you make use of it, you'll probably make a reductive use.
Well, yeah. So what's useful here is that if you understand the systems principles, that is the reason that say that the nervous system is working the way it is because of these principles and the way it's connected and the organizational structure and so on, then you can get to an understanding of why, for example, sometimes it goes into an epileptic seizure. That's a systems phenomenon, right? You can't get a reductive explanation of that, even though there might be a reductive cause like a mutation to a potassium channel, right? I mean, you couldn't get a more reductive molecular level cause.
And we've known about that one for a while. Yeah.
Yeah. And what you need to know is how does that emergent behavior arise? Why does seizure activity, which is a systems level phenomenon, arise from this little change? And in order to do that, you need to understand the relationship between levels, right? And that's where these systems principles can help. And it's where, what I want to say is, I guess we need a systems level explanation and systems level understanding if we want to be able to get to the point where we have reductive control. Because just doing the reductive experiments, which we've been doing for a long time, gives us this illusion of control. We do these really controlled experiments and we say, aha, I know how this system works. I can manipulate it. And then when we go into the real world with our new drug, that's cost $1 billion of R&D, and it fails, right? Why? Because reality bites, because complexity bites. And so we need a system, a science of complexity that can enable us to grapple with things in ways that will eventually enable reductive, manipulative control and intervention.
Yeah. I've been chatting with a friend about reductionism, and it seems to me that all science works reductively. I mean, logic works reductively, reason works reductively, right? But we go down certain paths, like we've done with genomics, and first it was just individual, genetics, and then that becomes a reductive path. What we have to do is kind of pull ourselves out of that, go back to system wide, like you're saying. So interesting. You talk about a science of complexity, and then develop a new reductive approach, because it seems like you always have to be reductive if you're going to use logic.
Well, if you want to do, especially if you want to intervene on a system, right? Then, well, I mean, in a sense, there's a couple ways that you could do that. I mean, so for example, if we look in psychiatric disorders, there's two ways to intervene on the system. There's a bottom-up way with drugs, right, where you're manipulating things at that molecular level and hoping to see some change in the emergent behavior. But there's also a top-down way, which is talking to people, right, and psychotherapy and so on, which is also potentially very effective. And in fact, you may really need both in many people, right? And so you're also affecting the system, but you're doing it in a meaning first kind of a way, by using meaningful language with people and getting them to think about things in meaningful patterns in their lives and relations and so on. Right? So you can intervene on systems in those two ways, and I think we could develop both kinds of things, even for some very basic, more basic biological conditions like cancer or so on, where it may be possible to intervene in a systems way to tell the cancer cell to convert itself back, for example, right? Kind of a top-down signaling way.
Well, that's what Mike Levin's working on.
Yeah, so Mike's
the other guest in this series.
So Mike's a very good examples of that, of a systems approach to intervention. I guess what I would say about reductionism is that I have been doing reductive lab science all my career. And of course, we've learned very, very important things by doing these really tightly controlled experiments. However, it's just important to realize that when you're doing that, you don't need to have a commitment to theoretical reductions. You don't have to, just because you can, under certain circumstances, isolate the function of a system, doesn't mean you have to be committed to the idea that the reason an organism does something is because these neurons fired, for example. Right? You can say, well, that's part of a system. In the real world, there's all kinds of other context, and it's a whole system, all things considered, judgment that's happening. So, yeah, I think we can continue to do our reductive experimental science. I just hope that we can accommodate that within a context that is both, in terms of computational methods, but also a philosophical outlook, more of a holistic systems kind of thing, and actually more of a process philosophy kind of a view, as opposed to the static mechanistic sort of view.
I don't mean to put you on the spot. Is there a book that somebody like me could take up? You mentioned you teach that class. I'm not in Dublin.
Right.
To keep pursuing these ideas.
Yeah, you know what? There's a bunch of books out there on systems thinking. Some of them are quite old, because there was the various movements, like the cybernetics movement, which is absolutely systems thinking, in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. There was general systems theory in the 50s and 60s. Conrad Waddington's work was very much systems-based, early embryologist. But again, in the 50s and so on. And I think it's it's kind of coming around again. And there's a book called Complexity by Melanie Mitchell, which is quite good. But you know what? I'm actually thinking of writing a book which would condense some of the content of this course specifically for biologists. This would be the book that I would have wanted to read myself when I was an undergrad, which would be kind of concepts of system thinking for biologists. So here's network theory. Here's how that's useful for a biological system. Here's control theory or dynamical systems or learning theory or whatever it is. The kind of stuff that we cover in this course, but specifically aimed at biology students who I think otherwise don't get exposed to this kind of stuff in the way that I myself was not exposed when I was, having my biology education.
Very cool. We got to leave it there. Kevin Mitchell is the author of Free Agents: How Evolution Gave Us Free Will. A fascinating read, as you could tell if you listened here, and will give you some very rich biology that really will take you even beyond the free will debate. It's fantastic. Thank you, Kevin.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.